Richard Norton Smith, when you and Mark Farkas decided the list for the Contenders, what was your objective?
To give viewers an alternative school of American political history in particular. It's famously been observed that the winners write the history books, and there's a lot of truth to that. But that means that we are deprived of, it's like the dark side of the moon. There's another whole storyline, and even more on the biographical level. There are 14 people in this series, many of whom I guarantee viewers may never have heard of, and all of whom I can pretty much guarantee they will find interesting to fascinating and certainly surprising.
Gene Baker, do you have somebody in mind that might have been the most important contender in history for the presidency?
Well, I think that some modern biographers say that losing candidates in the last 20 years, people have even said George Wallace is the most important loser. I don't think that at all. I have to go back to the 19th century and pick up with Henry Clay. And he ran 3 times. And that's one of the things that interests me about these folks. They sure are recidivists. They keep at it, and it gives me new insight into defeat, which I would think one of the most humiliating things that could happen to you. If you're Henry Clay, you've arrived at the Kentucky House of Assembly, and almost immediately everyone is saying you're a leader. You go to Washington, you're the Speaker of the House. What a humiliation. And yet he kept coming back. And I do believe that he's one of these 14 who, had he been elected, either in 1824 or 1832 or 36, that he really would have made a difference in terms of the history of the country.
As a journalist, Carl Cannon, which of these contenders would you like to have covered?
Oh, William Jennings Bryan.
Why?
Well, Gene spoke about recidivists. Well, he's a lifer, right?
Yeah, that is
He's
right.
got to go to San Quentin.
He and Harold Stassen.
Well, yeah, but he, you know, there are echoes of him even today. I was at a rally, not a rally, a Republican event, the Republican establishment actually in New Orleans, and all of a sudden this chant breaks out, "End the Fed, end the Fed." Well, that's Ron Paul's people. They're in the House. Yeah. And, well, that's the Cross of Gold speech, you see, in the modern version. And so not only are they recidivists, but their themes echo through the years. Yeah. They never, and finally, it's like they finally get their way, even if they lose.
Well, and that's, you know, they redefine defeat. I mean, one of the things you find as you go through this list is over and over again, there are people who lose an election, and in the immediate sense may be written off as a loser, but who in fact in some cases turn out to be catalysts for political changes that will transform the country. If you think of Al Smith in 1928, lost overwhelmingly to Herbert Hoover, but paved the way for Franklin Roosevelt and the urban immigrant labor coalition that sustained the Democratic Party up to and through John F. Kennedy. Or even more, Barry Goldwater, who lost overwhelmingly in 1964 to Lyndon Johnson. People said conservatism was dead, and the fact is Goldwater planted the seeds of a conservative movement that I would argue has yet to crest.
Would any of these contenders done better with television? Some of them had television, but a lot of them didn't have television.
I think let's try James Blaine, and let's try your guy.
Brian
Would certainly have done well.
When did Blaine run?
1884.
Against?
Against, help me, colleagues.
Oh, James E. Blaine. Oh, I'm sorry, Grover Cleveland in 1884.
Yeah. And that's a really funny American election that all Americans should know about it. It's the one in which Grover Cleveland has this child that's born out of wedlock, and so we have this wonderful couplet, "Mom, Ma, where's Pa? Going to the White House, ha ha ha." On the other hand, we've got James Blaine, who is corrupt in the pockets of the railroad magnates, and there's some compromising letters. Usually compromising letters involve females or sexual affairs, but in this case, it's something to do with his taking bribes and working for the railroad. So the American voter, on one level, is faced with this: who are you going to vote for? The personal sin or the kind of public sin of James Blaine?
Where did you
Brian,
go
To
ahead?
turn your question around, though, a common complaint of modern candidates, also rans, who are not elected, is that they would have preferred to run before there was television. That substance is driven out. In the 1984 campaign, I was covering Alan Cranston. I was a young regional reporter from California. He was the senator, the minority leader for a while, and he ran for president in the primaries. Well, he didn't do very well. He finished 6th, if you want to count it that way, but Reagan actually got more write-in votes in the Republican primary, and he had to quit. And we were on the airplane going back to Los Angeles, an old Delta plane to LAX, and Cranston says, I'm sitting beside him, he says, Carl, Abraham Lincoln couldn't be elected today. And I was taking notes, and I stopped taking notes. He said, you want to write that down? I said, I think I'll do you a favor, sir. I'm not going to put that in my story. And he said, why not? I said, and what he was getting at is that Gary Hart was his pretty face, and that he couldn't break through to be the, to be the guy who runs against Mondale, Walter Mondale. And I said, well, because Lincoln was the greatest writer we've ever had in that office since Jefferson held it, and if he was running now, all of the people on this plane, and I turned to all the reporters, we would quit and we would work for him. So no, Lincoln could get elected today.
Is there a contender on the list you think could have gotten elected today because of television that didn't get elected?
I'll tell you who would. Yeah, Tom Dewey would have done. Tom Dewey's career spanned sort of the introduction of television.
Who did he run against?
Well, he ran twice. He was nominated twice. He ran 3 times. He ran against FDR in 1944, and of course famously against Harry Truman in 1948. But remember, Dewey had been the gangbuster, this great courtroom prosecutor who became famous while he was still in his 30s for putting away the likes of Lucky Luciano and others. He was a courtroom performer, and that actually translated superbly well to a television studio.
Oh, now, Richard, let me disagree a little bit. I mean, this is a guy that has, and I have to look around to see that funny little mustache. And I think is it Claire Booth Luce who said he looks like he's an ornament on a wedding cake. Now, that might be a compliment in terms of
but the other side of that, think of the
handsome he is, but on the other hand,
he for example, he was a number of times, he couldn't be handled. The people who would be his handlers told him the first thing you've got to do is shave off your mustache. It reminds people of Charlie Chaplin, or worse, Hitler.
Yeah.
You know, and we're coming through World War II. And he wouldn't get his. He also had, remember the front teeth. There was a big gap between his teeth. He wouldn't do it. Why? His wife liked him the way he was. That tells you something about personal character, if nothing else. But I think as a persuader, someone who could marshal facts and make the TV camera his ally, I think he would have been.
Well,
very
Richard,
effective.
how about Wilkie, who runs in 1940 against Roosevelt? How would he have done on television?
it's a question of Richard. But,
Yeah.
No, I want to go ahead.
Well, Wilkie seems to me to be a little soft. He belongs where he came from, in corporate executive rooms. He doesn't have any public training. And I do believe that there's a certain level of exposure that contenders and winners need. Now, as long as I briefly have the floor, I'd like to present to all of you an idea of why it is contenders are important. I think sometimes when we talk about presidential politics, of course we're always talking about winners. Americans love winners. Don't talk about the losers. But we impose from our position just a one-person race, and we lose all of the context. At the time when Americans were voting for these men, they were looking at an entirely different landscape. And I think that sometimes we overinterpret interpret this, if we can get the contenders back into the race, and by the way, on the eve of the U.S. Open in tennis, politics is not, presidential campaigns are not a horse race. They're more like a tennis match where you have an opponent, and when we remove the opponents, then we lose, it seems to me, all of the depth and profundity.
I mean, I think that gets, in some ways, to go back to your original question, why this subject, why now? And it's a subject that has been too long ignored, and the timing couldn't be better as an alternative to exactly the kind of horse race, trivial, back and forth, poll-obsessed coverage that passes for most of political journalism.
Carl, who would you, and these questions are always asked, and they're somewhat trite, but who would you, of all this 14, Henry Clay, James G. Blaine, Williams Jennings Bryan, Eugene Debs, Charles Evans Hughes, and all, who would you like to have, three of them at a table, and you're the host for a little lunch or dinner party?
Well, a debate on capitalism between Wendell Willkie, who ran the utilities, and Gene Debs would be interesting. I'm not sure you'd need a third, but
I'm really
the populism of George Wallace, wouldn't that be a lively conversation?
I'm really talking about the kind of person that would be funnest to talk to among these 14.
Well, look,
Clay would be.
well, let's talk about,
conversationalist.
all right, Henry Clay.
Why would he be fun?
Well,
By all accounts, this was the most, along with Andrew Jackson, his great enemy, this was the most charismatic, galvanizing, polarizing, magnetic figure of the first half of the 19th century. And by all accounts, there was an aura, a spell about the man. It went so far beyond charm.
it was very nickname. The great compromiser. Here's a guy, the country's being split apart, and he wants to keep it together, but he's very much identified with one side. And he's a partisan guy who wants to unite people. I mean, all of the problems of the era you could get from this guy, and why we couldn't elect him is the same reason we eventually went to war. They couldn't be resolved.
He ran against three different people for the presidency?
Yes.
He ran, yes.
And he was Secretary of State and Speaker of the House and a senator.
And a very constructive statesman. I mean, that's the interesting thing about these. You talk about Blaine and Cleveland. I mean, each man with impressive blemishes to their personal or political character. And yet, if you look at their record in office, not only Cleveland's as president, he's generally regarded as the most impressive president between Lincoln and TR, but Blaine's as Secretary of State, these are very, very impressive.
Yes, and off the list, perhaps in a parenthesis, we should talk about some contenders.
How about Barry?
That we should forget. Parker.
Well, except that they're already forgotten.
Well,
we're piling on with Holton B. Parker.
But let me ask you though, you wrote a book on the Stevensons. Would you put
I would
Adlai
love
Stevenson at
to
the
have-
table?
have
Yes.
dinner, any meal with Adlai Stevenson.
Did you ever meet him?
No. I did spend some time with his son, who, as you know, was an Illinois senator and then resigned in 1980, made a big tactical mistake, went back and ran for governor in the state of Illinois and was beaten by Big Jim Thompson and retired from politics. That's the interesting thing about most of these people, I think, are really committed to anything in public service. And they're all effective politicians. Adlai Stevenson had that side to him of, I'm not sure I really want to be doing this. And yet he's given us some of the best epithets that we have in American life. In his campaign against Eisenhower in 1952, I remember I'll stop telling the truth about the Republicans if they stop telling lies about the Democrats. And about Richard Nixon, he's the kind of guy that will talk environment after he's cut a tree down and is standing on it to give a stump speech.
Stevenson, there are still a dwindling band of Americans who are proudly
That's
known
right,
as
yeah.
Stevensonians,
Yes.
eggheads. The idea of the intellectual. Now, the fact is, we now know it was greatly exaggerated.
Yeah.
In fact, the one book found on Governor Stevenson's night table, at the time of his death was the Social Register, which in some ways is a metaphor.
I'm not sure that's exactly true, Richard, but I'll give you a pass on
Well,
it.
but he brought civility, he brought up a high sense of purpose, and he brought great champagne wit. I mean,
terrific.
and a sense of the ridiculous
Yeah.
about this whole process. I
Yeah.
mean, going back to what you said, and he was a man ahead of his time. He's the first man to talk about the new frontier.
Yes.
In the 1956 campaign, he's talking about a nuclear test ban treaty. He's proposing votes for 18-year-olds. And that is another critical function of these also-rans. They often introduce ideas and that may not be accepted at the time, but who in fact find their way into the political bloodstream and become the norm.
But can we turn that around and say, do any of these contenders represent the past, a moment in history in which they campaigned and it was the end of a certain style, a certain number of issues, or whatever?
Well, back to Henry Clay, who Brian asked about. He's a tragic figure also in a way. The great thing dividing this country is the West is opening up, and we know that the United States is going to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But are those states going to be free states or are they going to be slave states? And Clay is standing literally astride of history. He wants the West open. He doesn't want the Union rended, but he doesn't want them to all be free states because he doesn't want his beloved South to be marginalized. And so that campaign of 1850 is the last time when you can really straddle that issue. And he paid for it, and we paid for it. Can we go back to Stevenson for a minute? Because I know you two are both interested in Stevenson, and I was thinking about echoes of the future in Stevenson. You know, he served in the UN in the Kennedy administration, and the Kennedys found him wanting. Well, he wasn't.
Oh, they certainly
he
did.
wasn't tough enough.
Yeah.
But what does that? But what does that really foreshadow? The future of the Democratic Party is Stevenson, not the Kennedys. In that sense, this idea that, and we hear it in Barack Obama, this idea that we're going to work with the world community, not dictate to the world community, that enters the Democratic Party's DNA. And
But you can even go back. You can go back and forth. The anti-imperialism of William Jennings Bryan, which finds expression in many ways in the Stevensonian, and then projecting it onto a George McGovern. The idea of America as a republic, not an empire. I mean, there are consistencies that are really extraordinary. Clay, you could look at Henry Clay. Again, this is what I'm talking about by an alternative way of seeing familiar facts. You can look at Henry Clay as someone who failed to achieve his goal in life. He never became president. But on the other hand, to the extent that he contributed, he wasn't the only one responsible for the Compromise of 1850. He died shortly thereafter. What did that do? That precluded war for 10 years. 10 years for the North to grow industrially and otherwise.
But on the
10
other
years,
side, 10 years for the South to gain a sense of independence. The Nashville Convention in 1852 begins this, is this idea that we are a separate unit, we may become a separate nation.
But imagine if the Union had broken in 1850. Does anyone believe there was the leadership? If nothing else, Henry Clay gave us 10 years for Abraham Lincoln to emerge. And ironically,
And you're
because
not including James Buchanan?
or even John
he
Fremont.
should have been an also-ran. And remember, Henry Clay was Lincoln's, he said, beau ideal was statesman. But one very quick thing, talk about how is this relevant to today? Well, remember a few years ago when I believe it was Bill Kristol and others at the Weekly Standard were talking about what they called national greatness conservatism. It's not a phrase that you hear much today, but it was very much one grounded in Clay was part of that tradition, going back to Alexander Hamilton. The idea of an energetic government doing conservative things, government as an engine of economic development. And Clay wasn't just about running for president. Clay gave us something he called the American system, which was an enormous shot in the arm to the infrastructure of America and the early American economy.
Let's do something that for those watching to catch them up on all these 14. Let me go backwards. Let me go to the newest one on the list that will be shown on December the 9th and do very quick. I'll move it very quickly and have you all just pop in with quick comments about what relevance these people had at that time. Ross Perot will be our December 9th program. What would you say about him?
Third party outsider, and in some ways a cultivator of what's very clear now, and that is lots and lots of American angst.
What would you say?
Even more specifically, a forerunner of the Tea Party in many ways. Ross Perot's great accomplishment was to insist that the two major political parties deal with the deficit.
Carl.
Well, I would add to that. I went to a concert at Wolf Trap Farm Park one day, and we had just had a conference where I was working on the newspaper saying, nobody cares about this deficit. And then Perot gives a speech about it, and then I go to the Wolf Trap, and John Hyatt, a musician, sings a song about it, and I think, parents do care about the deficit. And, Perot did two things. He may have gotten Bill Clinton elected, and he may have actually stopped this movement for a while. This Tea Party thing is very much, you talk to any of the people at the rallies, they think we're spending too much money. Perot talked about this, he had his pie charts, and we kind of laughed at him. He got 20% of the vote, or almost 20%, after he quit the race and entered, when he behaved in a flaky way, after he'd not really run for president, he still got 20% of the vote. And that's what you're seeing today.
We can come back to some of this, but let's go to our next.
Is that too long, Brian, on each one?
No, that's fine. Doing good. December the 2nd will be George McGovern. What pops out right away?
Well, first of all, in the immediate sense, George McGovern and his commission rewrote the rules by which the Democratic Party nominated its candidates.
1972.
In 1972, he was the immediate beneficiary of that. But in a broader sense, again, McGovern, I think, is very much in this tradition that you can take back to Stevenson, back all the way to another prairie populist, William Jennings Bryan. The anti-war strain of the Democratic Party. It's oversimplified to say the left wing of the Democratic Party.
Your first take?
To me, McGovern's when my profession, political writers, begin looking at the race so tactically and breaking down all the consultants. And, McGovern, he gave his speech at 2 or 3 in the morning. All these things, he picked the wrong vice president and took forever to pick him. He's the campaign where we start to pay very close attention to the mechanics of the campaign. And the fact that he loses in a landslide doesn't change that. We're hooked on process, and that's one unlikely legacy of McGovern.
Jane Baker.
I think of getting only 38% of the vote. That was a catastrophe. That's probably the lowest percentage in a two-party race in this century. And here is this guy that did not run a good campaign, and yet he understood politics. He had been able somehow in South Dakota to be elected. And I think that's really quite a challenge.
Let me go to our November 25th program with George Wallace.
Wallace ran as a racist. He was the last person to do it.
1968 and 72.
And he would hold these press conferences. I was in high school and college, and he would say, I'm not talking about race, I'm talking about welfare chiselers. And then the cameras would go off, and he'd turn to the print guys and wink at him and say, you know who I mean. And that was a period that was the passing of an era. That's the end of the discussion in a way that we were talking about Henry Clay.
Richard Norton Smith.
Yeah, I actually go back to what you were saying about McGovern. If you look at the Nixon, 41, 42%, 43% in 1968 and 60%, the vast bulk of that are the Wallace voters. George Wallace had an enormous impact on the politics and the government of his time. If you think of the Nixon Southern strategy, if you think of the Supreme Court nominees that Nixon wanted to put on, Nixon understood that for him to cement what people then talked about as an emerging Republican majority, it meant getting the Wallace vote, turning the South from solid Democratic to solid Republican, and here we are 40 years later.
Gene Baker, my memory is 13% of the vote he got in 1968. What comes to mind when you think of George Wallace?
Well, what's been said, but beyond that, a guy who really was corrupt in the sense that he manipulated public opinion in the South. As I understand his early career, this was a man who was not, as his predecessor, I think his name was Patterson, was an out-and-out racist who race-baited to get elected. But at some point, George Wallace understands that his private ambitions are going to require this terrible assault. And so he begins this process whereby he sells out. The other thing that's interesting about George Wallace is he sort of floods in and out of the Democratic Party, and he runs with this, what is it, the American Independent Party? Is that the name of his party?
He runs 4 times.
Yes.
People forget,
Yes.
first time against Lyndon Johnson, and he astonished that the first time the term backlash was coined. The idea that white voters angered by the passage of the Civil Rights Law and the social revolution that it implied would leave their traditional home in the New Deal Democratic Kennedy Party and vote for a George Wallace in the primaries and then migrate in time to vote for Goldwater that fall or to become conservative Republicans.
November 18th is Hubert Humphrey. What comes to mind?
Yes. Just a lot of heartfelt
You liked him.
emotion for our daughter was graduating from the University of Pennsylvania, and we went very happily to the graduation. And 3.5 hours later, after his 1.5 hour graduation speech, we left. But nonetheless, Hubert Humphrey, to me, was indeed the Happy Warrior, which is a name given to Al Smith, who I don't think that deserves it.
Who gives it? Who says the phrase "Happy Warrior" at the 28 convention?
FDR.
Franklin Roosevelt, a speech written for him, which was funny because Smith was no kind of happy warrior, but FDR was, and
that's
Hubert
right.
certainly was.
Yeah.
Play off of that, Hubert Humphrey, to you.
Oh, well, 1948, he leads the walkout of the, he prompts the walkout of the Dixiecrats. He tells the Democrats it's time to emerge from the shadow of states' rights and march into the sunshine of human rights.
Lost in 68.
One of the great moments in American political history that everybody, Republican or Democrat, should be proud of. That's what I think of Hubert Humphrey.
And he also
He's mayor of Minneapolis at that time. Sorry, Richard.
and he also transforms the vice presidency in a surprising way, because he had such a miserable experience.
When was he vice
Under Lyndon Johnson, from 1965 through 69, and subsequently, of course, his fellow Minnesotan Walter Mondale was offered the job by Jimmy Carter. Mondale knew all about Humphrey's experience, and Mondale, in many ways, as a result of what he'd learned from Humphrey, is the first modern vice president. He had his own office in the West Wing, not across the street in the EOB. He was a deputy president. He wasn't fobbed off with the space program or reinventing government or whatever else presidents give their vice presidents to fill time.
Can I add one other thing about Hubert? I mean, we could talk about him the whole 90 minutes.
Appropriately.
Yes.
We know he would.
Yeah, the Happy Warrior thing with him was genuine, and Billy Graham told me this story. And if you ever hear Billy Graham imitating Hubert's sing-songy Minnesota voice, he's quite good actually. And he moved to Minneapolis. Billy does. He moves to Minnesota to set up his ministry because that's the state that has the cleanest government and the most transparency on nonprofits. So Billy goes there and he's swimming in the Y, and as Billy Graham said, and when men swim and they all together, And suddenly he's there after his laps. He's sort of resting on the pool, and Hubert looms over him, also in the Altogether, so you can make the picture in your mind if you like, and reaches down and insists on shaking hands and says, "Hello, I'm Billy Graham. I'm Hubert Humphrey. I'm running for mayor, and I'd really like your vote." And
Gene Baker, we need to go to Barry Goldwater on November the 11th.
Do we really need to? Can I say one more thing about Hubert? No.
we're stalling,
no.
Brian.
Barry Goldwater.
Okay. Yeah, well, the beginning of modern conservatism, but also an unlikely politician. Some of these people seem to have absorbed it in their water or soup or whatever. I mean, here's Barry Goldwater, and he should have been in the head of the department store in Phoenix. And yet gradually he takes this path that I think is true of some other politicians, that they get into community affairs, and then, as you know, he's elected to the Senate, and he certainly is a man of principle. He has given us one of our perhaps worst quotations that we all
Lobbing
know.
the A-BAM.
Extremism. And he was the victim of a really dirty journalistic advertising trick by the Johnson campaign. I do think that that's an unfair kind of a political ad, and I would be interested in your
Richard Norton ran in
response.
64.
In
How bad did he
64,
get
the
beat?
problem is, in some ways, he set himself up
But how bad did he
for
get
that. He LBJ broke FDR's 1936 record, 486 electoral votes to 52. But it's interesting. Goldwater barely carried his home state of Arizona, and he took 4 or 5 deep southern states. Georgia, that had never voted for a Republican, Alabama, Mississippi. I believe he took South Carolina
So
and Louisiana.
Do you attribute to him the new Southern strategy that?
Yeah, well, the fact is Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
He voted against cutting off debate, and he voted against the act. Again, you could say a man of principle. Goldwater, in fact, himself had been instrumental in desegregating his family's department stores, in desegregating the National Guard in Arizona, but he was such a believer in states' rights and so constitutionally opposed to what he saw as federal coercion. I think the other thing, of course, with Goldwater is later on he became every liberal's favorite conservative because he called Jerry Falwell names. He was outspokenly pro-gay rights. He famously said, "You don't have to be straight to serve in the armed forces. You only have to shoot straight." And it was that.
Well, that was-
but it was that libertarian.
That was after he left the Senate. But even while he was in the Senate, Richard, when President Reagan nominated Sandra Day O'Connor to be in the court, and he'd said he'd nominate a woman, and so he took that literally, his own promise, and he nominated her. And Jesse Helms spoke against her, and she wasn't sufficiently solid on the right to life movement for Helms. And Goldwater was in Arizona. A friend of mine went out there. He was an Arizona television reporter. And he runs out there, "Where are you going?" And he said, like Goldwater had his hair on fire. He said, "I'm going back to Washington, and I'm going to explain to Jesse Helms that I'm the most conservative man in the Senate." Well, in some ways, he wasn't anymore.
Exactly.
And Falwell had made a statement that any loyal American should oppose Falwell's or O'Connor's appointment, an unfortunate choice of words. And Barry said any loyal American should kick Jerry Falwell in the ass. And so he's a transition figure, and
Yeah,
we can
he's
see through him and his career the change, the evolution of the Republican Party.
That's true. He was also a cranky guy. As he got older, he got crankier. And Bob Dole used to tell me when Dole was majority leader, if Goldwater was pissed off at something you said or did, he'd take his cane and physically let you know of his displeasure. I mean, he was we say we want authentic people representing us. He was authentic.
These programs are 14 in number. They're every Friday nights at 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock East Coast time, and 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock on the West Coast. And we're going down the list here of all 14 of them. They were people that ran for the presidency and lost. And the next one is on November the 4th, Adlai Stevenson, which is your specialty. How often did he run, and who did he run against, and how badly was he beaten?
He ran twice in 1952 and 1956. He had the misfortune of running against a great military hero, Dwight Eisenhower. And so I don't really think that there's any way that Adlai Stevenson could have won those elections. Americans like military heroes. It's true there were a few generals that ran that did not win, but Eisenhower is an unassailable character, and I'm not sure that Adlai Stevenson ran the most efficient campaign, at least in 52. He handled the media poorly. He would still be giving these lovely speeches, and you would see at the bottom of the screen that this is a program that's supported by the Democratic National Committee. He never could change his rhetoric and sort of couch it in the necessity of television time.
He'd run out of time. I mean, he'd be cut off in the middle of a speech because the speech, and people who were traveled with him were driven to distinction. He had great speechwriters too, by the way. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and John Kenneth Galbraith. And I mean, there's a whole generation of people. Newt Minow. I mean, the people that Stevenson brought into the process. But
still, these were not. He lost what in the high 40s, and then the second time he was in the lower 40s.
Well, he managed to
but
lose.
They weren't disasters.
No, but he managed to lose to a president during a recession. I mean, that's
you know
not
what?
easy to do. You're right about Ike. He was hard to beat.
But what's really amazing, the real number that stands out about 52 is how much the electorate grew. Something like 11 million voters more than just 4 years before. And that's, in part, that's a reflection on the Dewey-Truman choice, but more, it's a positive reflection. People were given these two spectacular candidates to choose from.
I would like to play up on the independent. This is Adlai Stevenson's contribution to modern American
All right, then I have another one. So good.
Okay. Yeah. It's cultivating this new group of independents. Now we all know that they're I don't know what the statistics are now. You
Roughly
probably
a third.
know, yeah. Are independent. They're not assigned to any. They don't choose any party, and it's Adlai Stevenson who begins in this sort of primitive campaign in Illinois to try to encourage independents to support someone who's an intelligent candidate.
Well, that's a perfect transition for me. His legacy is he's obviously an intellectual. Ike knows it. He beats him. So what's the moral? Well, the moral is the voters don't want an intellectual. So Eisenhower, as our friend Fred Greenstein proves years later, begins as president dumbing down his speeches.
Did he have to?
But it was a sign of how smart
going into
Eisenhower was.
That's my point. But also how he thought that Stevenson played. His lesson is people don't want the intellectual, and so he didn't want to sound like him, and so he would go in and cross out words that they'd written and make smaller words, and literally in his own hand. And the culmination of that is the great Saturday Night Live skit, because then you have a series of Republicans who campaign this way to this day. They don't want to sound the intellectual, and it leads to that Saturday Night Live skit where Reagan's in the room sounding addled, and his aides leave. And then he's brilliant and knows throw weights and great details of policy in the privacy of his thing. So Stevenson's jokes about eggheads notwithstanding, both parties decide that's probably not the way to get elected.
Is that one of Obama's
Smith, I need to move on
Yes.
because we want to go to October 28th. And how well do you know Tom Dewey?
I spent some of the best years of my life getting to know Governor Dewey.
Explain that.
In 1980, the summer of 1980, I left Washington, D.C., and moved lock, stock, and Remington typewriter to Rochester, New York for 1 year, where the Dewey papers were housed, and spent a year every day from 9 o'clock until 5 o'clock in a carrel going through boxes of paper and then going home and writing all night. I could not do it now. I wouldn't attempt to do it.
Why?
Because I'm about 30 years older. Hopefully 30 years wiser, but it was a remarkable story. There were multiple stories because you had the whole racket busting era, very colorful in the 1930s when Dewey was the nation's leading crime fighter. I mean, he has a unique background for a presidential candidate. In 1939, with Hitler about to invade Poland, the Gallup poll comes out, and it shows Thomas E. Dewey, the 37-year-old district attorney of New York County, leading Franklin Roosevelt in the event that FDR decides to run for a third term. Well, obviously, subsequent events intervened. The Republicans turned to a dark horse named Wendell Willkie. But Dewey would go on to be three-term governor of New York, along with Al Smith. He's generally regarded as one of the best governors of the century. He was one of those people who I think would have been a much better president than he was a candidate.
Do you have any remembrance of Tom Dewey?
Me, I'm a newspaper man. I have one. It's seared into our collective DNA. It's the Chicago Tribune headline: Dewey defeats Truman. So, your first day of journalism school, they tattoo you with that headline, and you're supposed to never assume facts again.
Well, let me ask you
because
on
Truman,
camera.
Dewey did not defeat Truman for our readers who are younger than us.
In 48.
Our viewers, yes.
48, yeah. But you write, you're the Washington bureau chief of the Real Clear Politics.
Yes, Washington editors, Mike.
Washington editor. But you do a lot of historical stuff.
Yes, you get my newsletter every morning.
Well, what makes you think that people want to read about history?
People want to. Well, history's fascinating, and people know it. You can't. It's got to be presented right, but they want to know about their world today. These things we've been talking about, they all have echoes. Well, we haven't. He's not one of the 14. He's not on the list. Bob Dole, but if we had 15, he might have been.
Oh no,
Dole,
I have another candidate for the 15.
All right.
Okay,
Well,
sorry.
so Dole gives a talk at the 1996 where he's nominated, and he says he's not against the teachers, but he's against the teachers' unions. He's attacked for this. Brian, it's not that long ago. It's 1996. Well, this year, 2011, we have documentary movies by liberals about the teachers' unions. We have a Secretary of Education who feels much the same way. He's more diplomatic than that. People care about history because it not only tells us where we've been, but if you listen really carefully, it tells you where we're going.
Gene Baker, do you have any more about Thomas Dewey and history?
I just think of him mainly as the gangbuster. I'm impressed with the number and the significance of the nicknames that some of these contenders and winners get. And you may have another nickname, but as far as I'm concerned, this was an effective guy who violated one of those laws to move beyond your pay grade. And I'm sure Richard doesn't agree with that. He's certainly an interesting man, but there's something about him that is not an effective American politician. And had he been elected, he would have been one of this group that I think would have done the worst job.
You know, I'll tell you where I disagree. If Dewey had won, and although this isn't necessarily part of the series, who knows? From time to time, we may in fact stop and speculate as to how history might have been different. Had Dewey been elected in 48, 44 is out of the question, you would never have heard of Joe McCarthy. Dewey would not have permitted. Dewey ran a machine in New York. And remember, Dewey took part in the first nationally broadcast political debate in the Oregon primary against Harold Stassen. And the debate was over one topic: should the American Communist Party be outlawed? And surprisingly, Dewey, the prosecutor, took the civil libertarian position. You can't shoot an idea.
What year did you publish your book on
The book
Tom
was
Dewey?
published in 1982.
And what's it called?
It's called Thomas E. Dewey and His Times.
What year did you publish? You've got a Mary Todd Lincoln book and a book on the Stevensons. What year was the
And
Stevensons?
James Buchanan.
James Buchanan.
He's not a
Excuse me.
contender.
What year did you do the Stevensons book?
1985.
How many years have you taught history at Goucher?
Since medieval times almost.
I mean, you're talking 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
The reason I ask you that, though, I wanted to ask what has happened over those years, and what has happened to the students
Well,
and their interest in history over those years.
Students are just coming back, and I don't want to be one of those lacerating parental types that saying that we have significant historical amnesia, but I do think that students think that the past is over. In fact, I've had them tell me that when they're thinking about what they're going to major in. It's over, it's gone. On the other hand, as you say, history is an abiding, enduring discipline and interest, and thousands of Americans, sometimes after they graduated with business degrees, ye gods, turn to history and find that it's the most consuming thing in their life.
How many years have you taught at George Mason?
5.
And what do you sense is the attitude about history among your students?
I guess I'm lucky. I have found, obviously there are exceptions, but I have found students to be particularly interested in the subject of the presidency. And one of the things, we actually cover all the presidents in 14 weeks. And we do everyone. And it's interesting because a lot of these kids, I always ask them, why are you taking the course? And a number of them say, well, I know a little bit about the people of the monuments on the mall, but I want to know more about, James Garfield or Calvin Coolidge, or, I want to know the hidden corners, the nooks and crannies of American history.
We go on to October the 21st in this series of 14 programs, and I see the name Wendell Willkie, a man from Elwood, Indiana, and also a one-worlder. What did that mean back then?
Well, yeah, he wouldn't have been a conservative Republican today, would he?
Was he a conservative Republican back then?
He was the corporate Republican then, and he was engaged in a national debate. We use the phrase class warfare now. Republicans use it pejoratively when Democrats talk, but you know what? That's what it was, class warfare. Although Willkie grew up on a farm and Roosevelt was to the manor born, Roosevelt and Ickes never saw any irony in that they would punish capitalists. They would plot aboard the yacht and to punish capitalists. But the point is, there was who's going to run the economy, the government or the big business, and it's a conversation we're still having.
What did Wendell Willkie look like?
Wendell Willkie looked like a bear. He was a great, big, larger-than-life, rumpled, wrinkled figure who nevertheless had an aura, who had a charisma. Harold Ickes famously said, going to your corporate point, that Willkie's candidacy, which sprung out of nowhere, seemingly.
And he never had a job.
No, he was a Wilsonian Democrat. He'd been a Democrat until the New Deal. But Harold Ickes said that Willkie's candidacy sprung from the grassroots of every country club in America. There's never been anyone like Willkie. It's hard to imagine there ever being anyone like Willkie. He was beyond a dark horse.
Did Gene Becker, did he ever have a chance of winning?
Oh, no. I suppose of all the kind of people who took Roosevelt on, he and Dewey probably had the most difficult issue. Although,
and what was
1940, isolationism versus interventionism, and as we remember, the United States was not committed, and Roosevelt was working hard on all kinds of changing public opinion, but also public policies. And Willkie, as it turns out, really was an interventionist and ends up with this book about one world, which I'd like to ask you all about. I've never read One World. Is it a pre-UN kind of?
It's the book Woodrow Wilson would have written if he had, lived in 1942, 43. And it goes to one of the things that runs throughout a lot of these contenders. While of course we focus, they're in this series because they were nominated. not just because they ran, but they were nominated by a party to run for president. But Wilkie is a classic example. His greatest service, arguably, to the country came after 1940, when he became an emissary for FDR.
And traveled during the war. Didn't
Traveled
he?
around the world and foreshadowed the realignment of political parties, which has arguably taken place since.
Well, also, Roosevelt outlived him. I mean, Wilkie died in 1944, and so did his running mate. I mean, we would have, if we would have,
the Speaker of the House
who
then?
knows what
would it
would
have
have
been?
been. So-
Wilkie was only 52 when he died.
yeah.
Does
But
anybody
it's
know?
somehow appropriate. I mean, he burned out. He lived his life like that, and somehow it wasn't a surprise.
October 14th, Al Smith. Al Smith.
The many ways the father, a father of the modern Democratic Party. Do you know
Where was he from?
From New York State? He was a governor. He was, raised in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge
And Tammany Hall.
at Tammany Hall, and yet classic Tammany Hall politician who outgrew his origins. Do you know the last Republican presidential candidate to carry New York City? Was Calvin Coolidge in 1924. 4 years later, Al Smith is the Democratic candidate, and
Who
Al
beat him? Who
Smith,
beat him?
Herbert Hoover, and Al Smith begins this process of forging an urban, rural, but mostly urban immigrant Catholic.
He also starts an uncomfortable conversation
Coalition.
that's not settled until 1960, and that is, can Catholics be fully respected and integrated? Can they be president? Can a Catholic be president? And there's openly anti-Catholic innuendo used against Smith, not used against Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy dealt with this issue, but Smith he's the pioneer. He's the one who had to do
There's the
it.
history
The
again.
other- the
John Kennedy
other
ran
reason-
against the ghost of Al Smith. Right.
The other reason Al Smith, besides the Romanism charge, the Catholic charge, these are good times. And in terms of this series, we talk about the biography, the personalities, but it's really important to have the context of prosperity. It was good times. Although there were these areas, especially farming, where folks in America weren't doing so well.
Well, we also know things about Hoover that we didn't know then, but remember, Al Smith is running against a guy who's personally credited with saving millions of lives in Europe after World War I. I mean, it's an Eisenhower type thing. This guy is a heroic figure.
His slogan, Who but Hoover, in 1928. But the thing about Al Smith also was, and it's relevant to today, Al Smith, in addition to his faith, was seen and heard as an alien figure. If you listen to Smith on the radio, this wonderful accent from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, this was a chance for people in America to vote against New York. This was a chance to vote against all that they thought was alien and un-American and somehow, vaguely, the immigrant.
How badly was he beaten?
Nativist. He was beaten very badly. He got 87 electoral votes, and Hoover broke open the South. It's not Eisenhower, not Goldwater, but Herbert Hoover who breaks the solid South.
October the 7th is Charles Evans Hughes.
Well, I think of him in the context, and I'm not sure that you two will, of women's suffrage. Charles Evans Hughes was a progressive on women's suffrage.
Ran against Woodrow Wilson.
Ran against Woodrow Wilson, and there were 4 or 5 states during this period that had women's suffrage. And so the idea of the women was to go and use their vote, get those states to support Charles Evans Hughes. And there was an uproar. The Wilsonians were furious about this. You just simply didn't do that. In any case, it didn't work. And Wilson is going to end up being the person who is pushed toward women's suffrage in 1920. But the other thing about the Hughes campaign is just how close it was. I think we think of Wilson as being somehow triumphant, but this is a very, very close election.
Hughes is actually one of the unusual figures in this list, in that his race for president is arguably one of the less distinguished chapters of an extraordinarily distinguished and useful career. He'd been a great governor of New York. Then he got on the Supreme Court. He left the court to run against Wilson in 1916, was Secretary of State throughout the 20s, generally regarded as one of our best Secretaries of State. And then his great impact was, of course, when he went back on the court and almost single-handedly thwarted Franklin Roosevelt's attempt to pack the court, showing he had not lost his political moxie.
Carl Cannon, Charles Evans Hughes, governor of New York, Thomas Dewey, governor of New York, Al Smith, governor of New York, of course, FDR, governor of New York. What is it about New York in those days? Because you don't see any of that now.
I'm writing a piece about this now, and I don't want to give too much of it away, but I'm from California, and when I was a kid, California eclipsed New York, and this happened over a gradual period of time. I mean, let's just talk inarguably, in population, so that's a fact. But in other ways, too, that New Yorkers were reluctant to admit. Some of them have admitted to this day. And what's happening now is maybe Texas is doing that to California. These things change. But Hughes, because he was a New Yorker, I'll say that he brought with him his attitudes, not just about gender, but about race. He's the racial moderate in that race. And if he defeats Wilson, Washington is not resegregated. That was Wilson's doing. Wilson went along. He didn't do it single-handedly. Hughes would never have gone along with that. And the civil rights movement might have moved along faster in a different stream. He's, of all the 14 on our list, he's the one where you start to war game if he'd have been elected, how American history goes in several different directions, on suffrage for women, civil rights. What does he do in foreign policy? Does he really, Germany sort of baited us into war, but Hughes have avoided that. He's the one you could write novels about.
He had a beard at least part of the time. Did he have a beard when he ran?
T.R. referred to him as the bearded icicle. He was a very chilly, aloof, full of rectitude. Yes, he did have a beard. When he stayed at Calvin Coolidge loved to pull practical jokes. And when Hughes stayed at the White House as his guest, Coolidge would send the White House barber up to Justice Hughes's room to give him a shave.
Crafting of the, but it was, as I remember, Wilson had to stay up. He was quite irritated because he had to stay up all night.
It was a couple of days.
Yeah,
California, California decided the race.
Whether he won.
There are two guys. One of them, by the name of, I don't know, he's a guy, but Norman Thomas ran for president as a socialist 6 times or something like that. And then the one that's on our list that we're going to focus on is Eugene V. Debs of Terre Haute, Indiana, who ran at least 4 times. What do you think of when you think of Eugene V. Debs?
I think of a guy, a principled guy who's at the forefront of labor movement. Yeah. And I think of him as a labor leader. He runs on the socialist ticket, but he's a guy who wants to break the trusts and wants to give the working man power. And we are, and again, we're in a time now. We're talking about public employees unions. There were no such thing. He was talking about labor, people who worked with their hands for a living in very dangerous things, and he fought for the right to organize. And his day came, but not in his time.
Mm-hmm.
No, and of course, he was also outspoken in his opposition to World War I, and was, for his pains, thrown into jail by Woodrow Wilson, the great champion of self-determination, and was ultimately pardoned by the even unlikelier character of Warren G. Harding, who, whatever else you say about him, was a kind man.
Yes, genial.
And he wanted, and in fact, Harding had one favor. He wanted Debs to come visit him. It was right about Christmas time. And he wanted, in 1921, I believe, he wanted to meet Debs. He'd never met him before.
He ran in 1900, 1904, 1908, 1911. Ran from prison in 1920.
we got what, almost 1 million votes in 1912.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit over. I think of Debs as separating American socialism. We forget now when we throw this pejorative socialism out to the Democrats that socialism at the turn of the century was a very viable philosophy, and there were socialists who were elected as a few in Congress, a couple mayors, and Eugene Debs is the one who separates American socialism from the European variety, but he's unable ever to make the case to workers that there can be electoral socialism. And yet, I think, again, he's a very principled, important contender.
September the 23rd, we're back to your favorite as you started off this program, William Jennings Bryan, ran in 1896 against McKinley, ran in 1900 against McKinley, ran in 1904 against William Howard Taft, lost all of those. What else can you remember? I mean, you mentioned the Cross of Gold speech. Why was that such a big deal?
Here's what intrigues me about William Jennings Bryan. He's so misunderstood. If one of your students has heard of him, he's heard of him as Matthew Harrison Brady in Inherit the Wind.
That's right. Yeah.
And this great play that was brought back after 9/11, and it's originally written as during the McCarthy period. It's supposed to be a morality tale against the Red Scare. It's brought back after 9/11, I suppose, to be a morality tale not to persecute Muslims. And William Jennings Bryan figure it's based on the Scopes trial, the monkey trial, where on evolution, and he's in the play and in the book and on television and all the movies. He's a buffoonish figure, but William Jennings Bryan wasn't against Darwinism because he was a flat earther or an uncaring bigot. He was against Darwinism for the same reason most of the liberals of his day were. It was conflated then with social Darwinism, and William Jennings Bryan was very much worried that Darwinism would be used as evolution would be used as an excuse to not help the poor and to not help immigrants and not help children and not help people with disabilities, and would be used in a way that would just have this sort of Nietzschean determinism, and that's what he was really arguing against. And I picked him out because he's this singularly misunderstood guy who today's liberals ought to venerate instead of criticize.
Gene Baker, would you have any idea who we could compare him to today?
Oh boy.
I mean, it's politics.
Well, let me tell you what I think about him, and then maybe that'll help generate a modern political figure. I think of him as, and this is why it's so ironic that he loses, he's a really good campaigner. Those speeches, there's several of them besides the Cross of Gold that are quite memorable. He also is committed to really campaigning. He's one of the modern presidents, one of the first modern presidents who gets off of his porch, as William McKinley did not, and travels around. I think he even campaigns in an automobile. Is he not the first?
Yeah, I don't know. But
first.
Oh, he loves speaking. Yeah.
There's an amazing statistic to show you how much Bryan transformed the campaigners' art. In 1896, more Americans turned out to see Bryan and McKinley in person. And that included the 700,000 who took the train to Canton, Ohio.
Yeah.
More people turned out to see them in person than 100 years later turned out to see Clinton, Dole, and Perot in person. I mean, it was an extraordinary time when people defined themselves by their party allegiance. It was as polarized as anything today. One other quick thing, though, about Bryan is one speech. I mean, the Cross of Gold speech so galvanized that convention. Without that speech, he would not have been nominated. Jump forward almost 60 years, Adlai Stevenson, who does not want to run, delivers a welcoming address to the Democrats. Jump forward 50 years, Barack Obama, in effect, delivers a welcoming, a keynote. So you can still, the connection between Bryan and Obama is one speech can make a career.
Did he have any other government jobs?
He was congressman from Nebraska,
From Nebraska, but
and he was a lousy Secretary of State.
Yeah, he was.
For whom?
For Woodrow Wilson.
Well, I wouldn't say he was lousy. He retired and
quit
resigned
protest.
over a principled issue.
But that doesn't
And
mean-
I always wondered why people like Cyrus Vance, that's the first
Right.
Cyrus Vance, not the
Yeah.
one who's the prosecuting attorney in New York, why Americans don't resign when there's an issue of principle. And
One
but
could
he did
concede
that.
his commitment to principle and still think he was
You
a
remember
failure.
what Cyrus Vance resigned about?
No, he did not.
He didn't.
He opposed something, and then it did not. Yeah, and would
I
not.
thought he stepped down.
I don't think so. But we'll check. We'll check
I thought he
it,
quit over the. Wasn't it over the attempted rescue? I thought it was the
Carter-
failed rescue of
the
the
Carter
American
failed rescue.
hostages. Wasn't that the?
I think it
the
was. I
issue?
mean, I thought he.
And then Edmund Muskie was appointed in his
So
place.
you think he did resign?
I think so.
So
but
I'm giving him a bad rap.
We're
Maybe I'll be.
we have a big hole here in this program that we're going to have to find out.
He's no William Jennings
And
Bryan.
whoever thought that Cyrus Vance would come up in the conversation?
September 16th, it will be James G. Blaine, 90 minutes, Friday night, 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock. My favorite story, it's not a great story though, is that when Louis Guiteau was sitting in Lafayette Park and Garfield, president, walks across Lafayette Park on his way to James G. Blaine's apartment, supposedly, and Guiteau, who ends up killing Garfield, is sitting there in the park, and there's nobody around James G. Garfield. James Garfield. Give us the James G. Blaine relationship with Garfield.
Well, not good. The thing about Blaine, though, is that he had a lot. He was the kind of guy that burned the bridges with lots of people. I think of Blaine as brilliant.
From Maine.
Blaine, I'm talking
No,
about.
he's from Maine, though.
Oh,
Augusta, Maine,
you
yeah.
want the
The
he's
continental
from
liar
Maine.
from the state of
Yeah,
Maine.
the continental liar from the state of Maine. Yeah, there's
took my
another
line.
one of those nice nicknames. But why continental? Does it mean that he reaches across
Yeah.
the nation?
Ran in 1884 against Cleveland.
Yes.
And before that, he'd run for the Republican nomination. And ironically, 1876, it was Blaine who prevented Ulysses Grant from coming back, or rather 1880. It was Blaine who prevented Ulysses Grant from making a comeback and winning a third term.
Besides being Secretary of State for James Garfield and for his
And Chester Arthur.
Chester Arthur.
And
What
Benjamin
else did-
Harrison. He was Secretary of State under 3 presidents.
What else did he do? Was he elected to another guy?
He was in Congress. He was Speaker of the House. He was a very effective, iron-willed
He
speaker.
changed some of the rules in the House. I'm not sure exactly which rules they are. It seems to me speakers of the House are always changing rules somewhat to their advantage. But, a smart, capable guy, but corrupt, probably.
And remember, this was the period after the Civil War when Congress was much more central, much more potent than it had been. The reaction against the strong executive set in. So to be Speaker of the House, to be a power in Congress in the 1870s, 1880s, meant a lot more than perhaps it would today.
Mr. Cannon, do you have anything to say about Mr. Blaine?
Well, I was curious about Richard. What do you think would have happened had he won? How would he have changed?
I think it would turn out to be, well, put it this way, I think he would be regarded as the best president between Lincoln
Very interesting.
and
Why?
TR, because he was assertive, because he had intellectual heft, because he had a lot of talent. And I think once he had actually achieved, people are consumed by, they lust after the presidency. It's a distorting, warping malignancy that they suffer from. And if they survive it and they win the office, and I think Blaine is someone like Clay. Clay and Blaine have a great deal in common. They're both very charismatic, polarizing figures who I think in office would have distinguished themselves.
I'd like to throw out the idea that sometimes we overdo the presidency, and especially perhaps in this era, that not much really would have changed if we shuffled these men around and put one in place of the other. Now, there are obvious exceptions, and they're worth talking about. And first, there is this jump from the Contenders from 1884 to 1824 and Henry Clay. And do we have a moment to stop at a really critical election in 1860, and where it really did make a difference who was elected. And I think it's like a chessboard that these presidents often, because American politics is so utterly centrist ultimately, that if they're over here on one issue and that's out of line, they're going to move a little bit back into the
The
center.
only counter to that is, if you look at the Republican, often dark horses who were elected, those bearded non-entities, that are all kind of swim in popular memory. Thomas Wolfe called them the lost Americans. Blaine stands out, both in terms of personality, the fact that he was a man of Congress, that he had demonstrated a capacity to control or govern
Yes.
in Congress.
Yes.
All I'm saying is he might have. The presidency itself was a diminished institution after the Civil War.
Yeah.
I agree with you. All I'm saying is the possibility for a counter-interpretation that there wouldn't be this blank wall
Yes.
of forgettable and forgotten.
And he
executives.
is memorable in Congress for the Blaine Amendment. The Blaine Amendment that you cannot take public monies and use them for religious institutions. So, he
Interesting
does
for
have-
someone who took public monies.
Yes, exactly.
I want to
For
get on
everything
the
else.
record, thanks to our producer, Mark Farkas, that Mr. Vance did resign in 1980 over the whole rescue in Iran. And so
Can we ask Mark to look up? I'm not ready to give up yet.
to give up.
If there was another issue that might be resignable over, not even
but
good
Gene,
English.
Gene, stick with your larger point. Except for Vance, why don't more
That's
of
what you
them?
journalists do.
Why don't more of them resign?
Let's go to September the 9th, our first program, and those who've just joined us during this discussion, C-SPAN's special 14-week series, Friday nights, 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock, on scene. We'll have cameras on scene in their homes and libraries and things like that around the country. The first one will be Henry Clay. Henry Clay ran, you said 3 times?
He was nominated 3 times. He ran 5 times.
5 times.
Yeah.
Starting in what? I have him running against Jackson.
1824.
1824.
1824. He was nominated again in 1832, and he was nominated in 1844. But he was a candidate in 40 and 48, and probably would have run from the grave in
He's
52.
a Kentuckian, but it will be at his home election committee. But has there ever been anybody that ran for as many offices, high offices, like Speaker of the House? I mean, he was elected Speaker on his first day in Congress.
Exactly.
At what age?
He is a man of superlatives. Whatever you say about Clay, he's just a larger-than-life figure. I would argue he's the best president we never had.
Well, I think Harold Stassen. No, I'm not arguing that he's the best president we've ever had. I am arguing that Harold Stassen certainly ran for as many offices as anyone that we've been talking about today.
Governor of Minnesota and president 6 times or something like that.
Yeah, but he became a joke.
Yes, he did. That's true.
he was-
That's
he
true.
Was Clay ever a joke?
No, I mean, people certainly, his ambition
yes,
was the subject
yes, he
of
was
considerable mirth.
Well, I don't know whether he was a joke, but Henry Clay was a nasty guy too. There was he used to pick on people in Congress, and one of the people that he picked on was James Buchanan.
Who
And
you wrote a book about.
yes, James Buchanan worked hard to be what he called a working senator and congressman. He was in both the Congress and the Senate, and there were all these other people who were simply mute. And he would say something in Congress, and Henry Clay would call him a Nancy man and make these terrible personal comments. James Buchanan was cross-eyed, and so Henry Clay would sit in his seat and sort of point to his eyes or go like this. And Clay, for all his brilliance,
Politics ain't been bad.
yeah,
You couldn't do that with C-SPAN's cameras in the chamber now.
right,
You would
see?
be. You
Yes,
couldn't
except
make
they're
fun
not.
of.
Yeah, but except they're not our cameras, and the Senate wouldn't show you a cutaway of Henry Clay doing this with his eyes. Very important to know. These are, we could go quickly. We've got about 20 minutes, 15 minutes left. We can go quickly through them again, just to, and maybe talk about something personal about them. Of all of them, the best speaker. Is it obvious who the best speaker of the 14?
Oh no, there's some great speakers on there.
Change over time.
But
You
why
know.
don't we just go around, because I bet we have different
Okay,
answers.
name your favorite speaker.
Hubert Humphrey. Best speaker.
Adley Stevenson.
Henry Clay.
Well, Brian, you can play.
No, I'm not the expert. You guys are. Let me ask then, who would you think would be the friendliest person of these 14?
Oh, also Hubert Humphrey.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Humphrey would be
Yeah.
right up there.
Yeah.
Although I think Wendell, I think
William
Wilkie.
Jennings Bryan.
There's some of that with Wilkie.
Who would be the smartest of the 14?
Oh, Henry Clay.
What about
And
your?
you probably would say Thomas Dewey.
Tom Dewey was. Yeah, I mean, brain smart. He won politically. Was politically smart.
Who did you say? Oh, maybe Stevenson. Huh?
Oh, I did not say Adley
No,
Stevenson.
no.
Oh.
You would think he'd be the
I
smartest.
said Henry Clay.
Yeah, maybe Stevenson.
Who of the 14 wasn't very smart? And I know that's sounds like a pejorative, but who wouldn't have been?
It really depends on how you're defining smart. I mean, there are people who are very good at running an office, but not running for office. There are people who.
Well, maybe which one had the image of not being very smart? I mean, you never know in
Sure.
politics.
Wallace.
Huh? George Wallace?
Who exploited it brilliantly. I mean, the irony is,
Yeah.
he exploited
He
the
had great
image
street smarts,
to
actually.
his populist advantage.
I mean, he almost bragged about it, but he had street smarts, though.
And of course, George McGovern, poor soul, was a history professor. We know that's not
And still alive.
smart
George,
to be.
And a World War II
To be-
hero.
yeah.
Authentic
a bomber,
hero
yeah,
of World War
a
II.
cerebral guy. Maybe. Yeah, let me
Who
change
also-
my answer. McGovern's as smart as Adley. He's a very bright person, but runs. But you remember this, but runs one of the dumber campaigns. So, what does
Who
that
would
tell
have
you?
been the
Well, the
nastiest?
smartest.
Yeah.
Charles Evans Hughes.
What, the
I'd nominate
nastiest?
Hughes, the smartest.
smartest.
I would.
Who would have been personally the nastiest? I mean,
Oh, Henry Clay.
what do you think?
I would not dissent from that.
Well, if you're African American, you might want to say George Wallace.
That's a different kind of nasty. Yeah.
All right, the three of you.
He
The
didn't
three of
define
you.
it.
The three of you write for a living. You've done a book on Tom Dewey. You've done a book on Mr. Stevenson. If you had to pick another one of these, say, Carl, you've done what, about 4 books?
Yeah, but I share some of them, so I don't know how you add it up.
It's okay.
But if you had to pick one of these 14 to write a book on and spend a couple years with,
Oh, wow, that'd be fun. Let Richard go first. Let me think.
Well, it's two
I
different
bet
things,
Richard's writing a
because-
book about
Because the
someone
fact is, and I mean this very sincerely, Gene has written what I think is not only the best, but in many ways a definitive book on the Stevensons. On the other hand, the chance to spend a couple years with Adlai Stevenson,
You're saying you could do
whether
it,
or not I
Cameron.
produce the
He's
book,
He's being polite.
but no, but I think to spend in the intimacy that an author has with a subject.
Who would you say?
The question is, who's the best company?
He said Stevenson.
I think Stevenson.
All right,
would be,
no, that's not the question. The question is, who would you write a book about? I mean, we
All right,
do
Brian,
the best.
I'm ready. Gene Debs.
Gene Debs,
Yeah.
why?
They're two excellent.
Yeah, there are. Well, he didn't say it doesn't have to be the first book.
Well, I know, but
It has to be my book.
Well, yours would be-
I think it's something. It's the best kind of history. We're still arguing about it. It's about the labor. What's the role of labor? How much rights should workers have, and who should speak for them? I just think that Debs and the labor movement is just a great chapter. And again, because we're still arguing about it.
George McGovern.
Why?
Well, for one thing, he's interviewable, and that I think is a really tremendous help when you're trying to penetrate a career. And I think that his, he did get to sort of be a joke, but he's a very honorable man, and I admire deeply what he was trying to do during the Vietnam War. He was obsessed with it.
If I'm writing a book, it'd be Charles Evans Hughes, and I think the world needs. There's only one biography.
needs.
The world needs.
Needs a
It's been 60 years since a Washington Post reporter named Merlo Pusey wrote a 2-volume sort of Life and Times, which is good, but 60 years later, it's a bit dated. And Hughes is what we claim we want in both a presidential candidate and a president, a man of absolute integrity who would not yield to the special interests. And
Let me go down the list here a little bit and ask you if Ross Perot had not dropped out in that June of 1992. He got 19% of the vote, but that was after he had dropped out. Do you think he would have done? He was 33. I think I remember a poll of 33% ahead of the other two candidates.
Brian, people don't remember this, and it wasn't that long ago. He was leading, and he was leading an incumbent president. He was leading the guy who was destined to win the election, and Bill Clinton was a distant third. And as late as June of that year, a friend of mine who worked at the Democratic National Committee called me and said, I've been doing some research and I'm worried that Clinton's going to finish so far behind these other two, we won't qualify for federal matching money in 4 years. Now that's where Perot was when he dropped
Yes,
out.
but June polls are June polls.
This is June of the election year. This is not now.
Well,
But he still got 19% when he came back.
In an 8-day period, Ross Perot drops out of the race. Bill Clinton chooses Al Gore as his running mate. They go to New York for the convention.
hugely successful
They have a first
convention.
united convention, Democratic convention in my lifetime. Bill Clinton emerges from that ahead in the polls, and it's, as far as I know, to this day, in any mock heat, Bill Clinton has never trailed a Republican again. So my point is, I'm not saying he would have won. I'm saying these things are not written in stone. There's nothing inevitable about him losing.
What do you think of the fact that Ross Perot really has never agreed to talk about the 92 election? He ran again in 96. I think he got 8%. But,
Right.
There's never really been much written about him since then.
I know, it's curious. I mean, let's face it, he is an unconventional politician. I'm sure he would not regard himself as a politician. It's curious because he made a significant historical contribution. He arguably changed the course of American history, and the echoes of that are with us even today. So he may be one of these people who just on principle doesn't want to live in the past, or it may be that there are scars from that campaign. He may be bitter about the way he was treated in that campaign.
And
Who knows?
the issue was the letters, the daughter. The daughter was getting married. There was some personal issue.
He mumbled something about that, but there was never any satisfactory explanation to why he either quit the race or got back in the race. I covered that campaign. I have no idea, and I'm not sure Perot knows. And he may be bitter. He also may have some recriminations aimed at himself.
Yeah, a mercurial figure.
Let's go to George McGovern for a moment. How did Richard Nixon, after Watergate, beat George McGovern, and it would have made any difference if he hadn't given that speech at 3 o'clock in the morning at the convention?
Probably, yeah, probably. I don't know. I think we're hyper managing campaigns in the context of what really happens when voters go into the polls. I'm sure, to get back to the Perot issue, that a lot of Americans who might have voted for Perot thought, gosh, he's dropped out? What's going on here? And then, because he was a third-party candidate, didn't vote for him. But I still think that the McGovern can pull on. The party's not over, in David Broder's title, and McGovern can draw, presumably, on this pool of Democrats. Where did they go?
But you know what? I think we tend, very understandably, because of the way the Nixon presidency ended, we tend, I think, to overlook and, in fact, to minimize Nixon's achievement in forging, in effect, a new political consensus. The fact of the matter is, by 1972, for a whole host of reasons, including a kind of counter-reaction to the Civil Rights Revolution, to the women's movement, to the anti-war movement. I mean, the silent majority was real. whatever you think about it. And Nixon very skillfully played to not only their fears, but also their notions of American exceptionalism. And McGovern, rather haplessly, was sent over from central casting in some ways.
There-
I mean,
there was
he
a-
was a quasi-academic. Not, I mean, he was a war hero, and yet he was.
Yes, but
he
there was,
portrayed
there was
as-
another war going on, and there's a moment in that campaign where McGovern is asked on Meet the Press or one of these shows, you know, you say you'll get us out of Vietnam the day after you're inaugurated. What about our POWs? And he sneers and kind of rolls his eyes and says, "Well, I'll go to Hanoi on my knees if necessary." And he doesn't mean that literally. He's just quarreling with the premise of the question, which is that pulling out would make it harder to get the POWs out. But wait one minute. But to make a remark like that, you see, if he gives his speech in prime time, if he doesn't mess up the Eagleton appointment, he wasn't, the way Richard says, he wasn't really in touch with swing voters. I mean, I'm saying that that's the most mild way I can express it.
And was he ready for prime time? That's the question. That might be a question to apply to some of these other candidates as well.
Who was and who wasn't?
He carried, Look, he carried the District of Columbia, Massachusetts. He did not carry his home state. I mean, he was not, it was a landslide election. And there was the other thing he did in the macro thing. The way he ran that campaign was he and the Democrats asked this question: do you really think Dick Nixon has the character to be president? Now, that's to your question, Brian. Watergate was not fully known then, but it was starting to emerge. The answer to that universally was, well, no, not really. We never did. He is the president, though. And the question is, how's he doing? And that's what Richard's.
And that's, see, usually a re-election campaign is a referendum on the incumbent. 1972 was as much a referendum on the challenger, much as Barry Goldwater in
Well,
1964.
how important was the Eagleton fiasco?
It reinforced
What
a
people
sense.
already thought.
Explain that for those that
Yeah, Thomas Eagleton was a senator from Missouri, kind of moderate Democrat, in many ways a natural balance for George McGovern. Not his first choice for vice president, but nevertheless,
His last.
He was nominated, and subsequently it was revealed, and he had not told the senator or those around him that he had been treated for depression.
Yes.
I believe it actually received electroshock at some point. At a time when that conjured up Tennessee Williams, images, from Suddenly Last Summer and Elizabeth Taylor, who actually might have been a better running mate for George McGovern. But in any event, he subsequently withdrew from the ticket, and it reinforced the notion this man is not ready to be president.
Brian, the vice presidential pick is often the first time the American people get to see this nominee make a big decision that's their decision. It's the first time, and it sticks with them for good or bad.
Yeah.
Now, we only have a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure we do one last thing, and that is, do any of you have recommendations for the audience of a book they can read that will be particularly interesting and fun for them in regard to all these 14 contenders?
All of them. Oh, well, there's
Or-
an encyclopedia, is there?
Well, there's the classic, somewhat out of date, but timelessly readable by an author named Irving Stone, who's best known actually for his novels and historical fiction, and it's called They Also Ran. And it's probably 30 to 40 years old. It's
What about an individual biography of Henry Clay, James G. Blaine, Williams, Jennings Bryan, Eugene
they're
V. Debs?
available. Yeah.
Charles,
Robert
I mean, anyone
Remini
that-
on
there's a-
Clay
there's
Any
and-
favorites?
There's a wonderful new
Yeah.
biography. The couple, the married couple, academics who wrote the Clay
Henry
biography. Begins with H. The name eludes me.
I'm embarrassed because I interviewed him. I want to say Heidegger, but I'm not sure.
That's
It's something like that.
Yeah,
It's a wonderful book.
The author's
They're-
name.
the
when we
Hei-
talk
no, the
about-
Heidlers.
Yeah, Henry Clay, the
Heidler.
essential,
Heidlers, they were from Colorado.
the essential
yes.
American.
Somebody
And they were-
Heidler.
All right, well, since we're
In
all...
their favor, they were an excellent interview. They sat right here, and I apologize.
Well,
for
let
that.
me have my own Alzheimer's moment then, since you...
Thank you very much.
There's, if you want to know about Wilkie and Dewey, you want to know that era, the books about the Depression, there are two books. I think you have to read them both. They're from different sides. One is the Eric Alterman book on Roosevelt and the Depression. I have the book. I have it signed by Eric. I don't have the title in my mind, but you can find it in this day and age. And the other one is The Forgotten Man by Amity
Slaves.
Yeah, and you read those two books. They come in from different
One from the
standpoints.
left, one from the right.
Pretty much, you'll understand Roosevelt and Wilkie, and it sets up, and you'll understand the environment that Dewey ran in. So that's 2 of the 14.
Need to remind the audience once again, this program is called The Contenders, that they're going to be able to see on 14 different Friday nights, starting September the 9th. You teach at Goucher College. Where is it?
It's in Baltimore, Maryland.
And what kind of a school is it?
It's a coeducational liberal arts school.
And your favorite course that you teach in history?
Women's history.
Carl, you write for realclearpolitics.com. What is it?
It's a website, and we aggregate the best political writing of the day and the best videos of the day, and we have our special sauce, if you will, is the Real Clear Politics polling average, that as this campaign gets going, all the political junkies around the country and everybody who's interested will get on our site and read. And we do original content. We have, if you don't mind me saying, 2 great political writers, Scott Conroy and Aaron McPike, and Alexis Simondinger, who covers the White House for us. So we have and then we do our own content as well.
And Richard Norton-Smith, I don't know where to start. I mean, I could ask you once again how the Rockefeller book is going, or I could ask you, this series was partly your responsibility, and you're going to be involved in it. Why do you think it matters?
Well, I'll go back to what I said. I think it's an alternative way of looking at our history generally, but it's great fun to have the opportunity week after week after week to make the acquaintance of historical characters, and some of these characters, the odds are you don't know very much about, and I think you'll enjoy the experience.
Thank you, all 3 of you, and our producer, Mark Farkas, for putting all this together. And we look forward to 14 weeks of the Contenders.
Thank you.